Hey guys, so we've had several regional as well as national level events post ban list. So as usual, I wanted to create a tier list of the best hand traps and staples using data from wideviewscope.com for Dueling Book data, as well as looking at cards that were in topping lists from the recent national level events. So you can always check my older videos in terms of learning how the score is actually calculated. And before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual. Links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies below that you can check out. So in terms of the tier list of the staples and hand traps for this month, we are going to start with Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Honestly, not surprising. For the most part, this is usually number one. It's always in, well, at least almost always in most people's topping deck lists. It's just very generic, good against Branded and Labrynth in particular, but really can just hit every deck, so it's kind of a safe main deck choice. So next we have Talents, which is a card that's definitely been seeing a lot of increase in play lately. Obviously in the previous format with Super Heavy Samurai being the best deck and Perle being somewhere along there, they were very, hand trap heavy, and so this card was definitely very, very live. But even post this, new ban list where those two decks are not really considered as the best anymore, this card is still going to be live quite often, especially going second nowadays. This card is pretty much always going to be live, and it's really, really strong and can really change the tide of the game, and definitely can also punish your opponent when they hand trap you, and it was kind of like low impact, and now you get to rip out another card out of their hand, making it very, very difficult for them to be able to play through your board. And then we have Dark Ruler, and this is also a card that's been seeing a bit more uptick in play lately with this new ban list. Obviously, kind of Runick Spright is back in the mix, and anytime there's any kind of Sprite, Dark Ruler is always going to be popular. But on top of that, you have something like, let's say with Kashtira, they're not really zone locking 5U anymore, so at least it actually is not totally useless like it was before against, something like Shangri-La when they already locked all your zones. Against Branded and Labrynth, obviously it's not that great, but you know what, in general, this card is kind of like one of the better going second cards that you can always side in against most decks, and Dragon Link is coming back in play a lot as well, and this card can certainly be good against them as well. Next we have Cyclone. This card I think is super good right now, because especially if you look at some of like the best decks right now, even if you were to go first and you have Cyclone, it's still going to be live in most instances, right? Like Kashtira, they have like Rebirth, you have Branded, they have Lost, you have something like, I don't know, Labrynth is going to be good, right? Because they have so many back row sets, and even against some of the more tier 2 strategies, let's say like Rika, you get rid of their field spell, that's kind of a big blow, and you have something like Fluandrees coming back again, and you definitely have a couple cards that you can hit in that strategy as well. And I think Cosmic, especially the fact that it plays around Runick, which is another big deck that I should have mentioned earlier, it's really nice that it doesn't really destroy but rather banishes, so you can kind of play around that Hugin protection as well. So it's certainly something that will or at least should be in your main or side deck. And then we're going to cap off the tier A with Imperm. It's usually a really popular hand trap, so this is not surprising, but especially when you look at the fact that Talents is played so often, and this at least plays around that, I think is kind of one of the key reasons why it's seeing a lot of play right now. The only downside right now is that something like Vanquish Soul has kind of entered the mix as another tier 1 deck, and Imperm against that strategy is for the most part not that amazing, and obviously it's not going to be great against something like Labrynth either, so it's kind of like has pros and cons, of course, but you know what, still for the most part really good card. Moving on to tier B, we have Feather Duster. Really not surprising again, as there's just no drawbacks to this card. You can just blow out your opponent's back row. The Hugin protection can definitely be annoying though, so that's something to look out for. But other than that, for the most part, this similar to Cyclone, it's going to be relevant against most decks right now. Speaking of relevant, is also evenly matched. This card is really deadly against so many strategies. Obviously, if they have some kind of like Omni Negate, Dark Ruler plus evenly matched is usually like the best 2-card combination you can ever see going second against most strategies, maybe excluding Vanquish Soul at this point. But nonetheless, again, something like Branded, if they didn't kind of go for that gimmick lock or, have Sanctifier in general, like evenly really just cooks them. Against Kashtira, it's been very strong. Against Labrynth, it's also, for the most part, really good, right? They are a back row heavy deck, so certainly really strong. So can't go wrong with this card. That's definitely something that's probably going to be in most people's side deck. Next we have Bestials, and for the picture I just used Magma Nut, but really this represents more so Bestials in general, right? Something like Druid's Worm is almost always going to be sided alongside with like a Magma Nut. Depending on the deck, you're also probably playing with something like Serenier or Baldrake, right? Something like Dragon Link or Branded, they're going to be playing at least some Bestials as part of their main deck engine, but a lot of a non-Dragon Link or non-branded will also be siding these because it can be really devastating against certain matchups. For example, branded being a key one, right? You can, let's say, banish your opponent's Albion Dragon before they go into the end phase with Magma Nut. Then you can also search like a Druid's Room and you have like another banish. It really puts a lot of pressure, and it's insane how deadly it can be. And it can actually be pretty good against a lot of rogue decks too, because they just happen to be light or dark for the most part. Obviously, there are some other decks, for example, let's say like Kashtira being the main one, or let's say Flunder is coming back and play a lot right now, as well as, you know, Rika is also seeing a solid amount of play. Those decks are not going to get hit by Bestials at all. So in those instances, the Bestials can be quite bad. So I can see why when you look at some of the top cut breakdowns, that especially the ones I did recently, you know, not everyone's playing Bestials, but definitely makes sense whether you decide to play it or you decide not to play it. Next we have Ghost Spell, which is definitely a hand trap that's been increasing in play. Obviously it can hit decks like Branded as well as Labrynth, so it has, and it actually has applications against a lot of decks. I mean, I guess something like Kashtira and Flunder, maybe it's not so great, but also kind of related to Bestials, because there's such an increase in playing Bestials, you can use Bell to also protect yourself from getting Bestials. So it's definitely can come up, and in case, let's say, something like Branded might be the difference between you being able to resolve that gimmick lock and your opponent just straight up losing. So really strong card right now, and definitely something worthy of side deck contention. And then we have Shifter. So it's definitely, this is usually as high as it can get in terms of tiers, just because Shifter is not something that can be played in every deck, right? And if anything, it's usually played in almost only a small number of decks. But as you can see, you know, match win percentage is definitely quite high when this card was used. I always do throw a bit of caution though in terms of interpreting win percentages when it comes to cards, just because this only means that this was the win percentage in that match if this card was played at any given point in that match. So it doesn't necessarily mean the actual game that this card was played. So just be cautious of that. But regardless, with a high impact card like Shifter, I do think that the higher win percentage definitely can be attributed to Shifter, because it just turn ending for a lot of strategy right now. Interestingly enough, we're in a position where it's not really seeing main deck play, just because, you know, a top deck like Kashtira is not going to care. And then, you know, like Flunder is coming back, and even Exorcists just won the remote YCS. Big congrats to Steven. I did do a deck profile with them if you want to check that out. They can also play Shifter, of course, and that's kind of what they're known for. So, but for side deck purposes, it's very great. And then we have Thrust, of course, kind of related to talents, which that's seeing an increase in play. And, you know, when you have Thrust, you can search talents and kind of go off from there. And Sky Striker, this is like really integral in that strategy. And Striker also finished top 16 in that and a remote YCS, which is another profile I did with Dylan Fricker that you can also check out. Really strong in a lot of strategies, but especially when you go first and you can set something as powerful as D-Barrier, although admittedly that's actually not seeing that much play right now, and at least something like, you know, a Pointer's Band. But then maybe if you can play Eradicator, that's something you can also set. So really strong applications going first or second with this card, and really very strong. And then we have Dueling Book. Definitely saw a huge decline now since, like, let's say the last time I did this analysis. I mean, especially when you have something like Super Heavy Samurai and Pearly last format, this was definitely a main deck guarantee in almost every deck list. Nowadays, not so much anymore. Definitely not really a main deck card anymore for the most part, I would say. You know, it's obviously not going to be great against something like Labrynth, for example. Against Branded, a lot of people just kind of brush it off and say it's really bad against Branded, but it actually really depends. As a Branded player myself, sometimes this can actually just straight up end your turn, because let's say you had to, you know, tragedy effect to add like that Aluber, and then now you're just stuck on draw, and then you can't get access to Branded Fusion. But obviously it's not really a card you would specifically side against Branded, that's for sure. But I think it still has application in this current format. You know, you do have Dragon Link coming back and play again, and Droll is very good against that strategy. And something like Kashtira and Flunder, Droll can be really good. That's just that problem is that Shifter, if they manage to use it, then you just cannot use Droll because it does have to go to grave. So those are some things to consider. And then kind of in the similar lines as Nibiru, definitely saw more play the last time I did this analysis. I think it's still pretty decent against at least like rogue strategies. This is usually a pretty big one, but you know what, I guess against the current meta strategies, maybe it's not the best. I can definitely see why it's certainly fallen in play. Definitely not really a main deck card anymore either, but I think it wouldn't really surprise me though if I did see my opponent drop this on me, even in this format. So moving on to C tier, we have Book of Moon. This has definitely been seeing a lot of play lately. Definitely the more popular book of whatever choice compared to something like Book of Eclipse, which originally was like by far the most popular staple that was played when Kashtira first came into the mix. So this is really good. Obviously going second, it's almost always live and has like very good application. But even when you go first, depends on the deck really. Let's say something like Flunder. Before Advent came out, Book of Moon was really like a staple just to be able to dodge something like Imprimer Veiler. But even now with Advent, I'm seeing Flunder lists still play Book of Moon. It's really good, and especially not only to protect your own monsters with Book of Moon going first, but against certain strategies. If you Book of Moon like their first normal summon, they can't like link summon, for example, with it, or exceeds whatever. It can be really strong. Next we have Call by the Grave. I mean, not too surprising. It's a good card, but it's not really like something that's seen in every list as it had been. Let's say like you rewind back a year ago, something like when DP was in almost like most meta lists, and you really had to play this because aside from stopping hand traps, it also had a lot of applications, especially stopping that DPE. But nowadays, you have something like, let's say, Kashtira, where yes, they do play a lot of hand traps, so Call by the Grave can be relevant there, but at the same time they don't really have their main engine stuff going on in their grave, so it's not as versatile against that strategy, which is kind of unfortunate. So I can kind of see why it's sort of fallen down to this C tier. And then next we have Pankratops. It's kind of feeling like 2019 again. In the recent Nationals breakdown I did, we were definitely seeing more play of Pankratops in the side deck list. I mean, it's obviously a really good card going second. Like, it can just either hit a monster or back row. It's got a big booty, so it can attack over as well. Kind of when Fenrir first came out, this sort of just got pushed away. But you know what? They have different applications, and so it's still a really good card worth siding. So next we have Lightning Storm, which, it's funny, I almost feel like it sees more play now that it's semi-limited with this new ban list than it did before. I've been doing these analyses. You know what, but really strong card, can hit monsters back row, but for the most part you're using it for back row. And right now, as I mentioned, along with the lines of Cosmic or Feather Duster, like a lot of decks, you're going to have at least some form of back row that's an interruption that you can get rid of at least with Lightning Storm. Solemn Judgment. So this is a card that I recently sort of complained about, saying that I think it should go back to like something like 1, and obviously a lot of like the back row enthusiasts got upset with that. And what I was trying to say though is that it's not just back row decks that play Solemn Judgment. Historically, we've seen a lot of your traditional combo decks, going first decks, that are playing this in the side as well, which makes it even more harder to go through their board on top of Solemn Judgment, especially when something like Red Rubid is banned, so we just can't stop Solemn Judgment at all. Interestingly though, the match win percentage was quite low with this card, but keep in mind, I always notice this with Solemn Judgment, aside from the fact that, what I mentioned about win percentage, that you have to interpret with caution when it comes to this one, but Solemn Judgment usually is pretty low. My suspicion though is that a lot of like rogue strategies are kind of playing this, and it just inherently, because they don't really do very well, it also brings down the match win percentage for Solemn Judgment down as well, but those are just my thoughts. So next we have Kaijus, and so I'm just using Gameciel as a picture here, but really this represents all Kaijus. I mean, Gameciel is definitely the most popular one, especially in the recent video I did breaking down some of the topping lists from Nats, but there's still an uptick in play of something like Humongous as well as Dogoran, just because those are fire and earth, and that is relevant to the Vanquish Soul strategy. So Kaijus was a bit more popular last format just because of Pearly, and they were able to go into Noir pretty easy, and that thing is pretty much like unaffected. Now with that ban list, they don't go into it as much, so it kind of definitely saw a decline in play. But you know what, again, something like a Rizard, just like any kind of spot removal, it's really nice to have. So certainly something that's still in people's side deck list, but definitely not as much. And then we have Super Poly. This one was kind of interesting because I kind of thought that it would only really see play in branded for the most part. And even in branded lists, you're actually going to start noticing that among these topping lists, they've kind of cut out Super Poly in a lot of them. And so I actually did notice Super Poly in some other non-branded lists as well, like Vanquish Soul was another one. I think some Sprite list was playing it. So it has application. Like, I mean, for example, like, at least let's say against branded, actually, like you can easily get rid of something like Sanctifier and let's say, I don't know, a Granule, and you can stop that Gimmick Lock, and it's just a card that you just can't really stop. It kind of can be matchup specific, but you know what, if you're a deck, let's say like branded, you can kind of make this live a lot easier than just kind of any other deck. So something worth considering. And then we have Veiler, not much to say, just another monster negate, but at the same time, Imperm is just a much better choice right now, just because of something like Talents, so I can see why this is definitely fallen off. So next we have Eradicator, and I'm actually kind of disappointed this made it on here because it essentially means that this card saw enough play to make it onto this tier list, even though that this is a card that it's only seen in specific decks because you do have to be able to meet that requirement of, let's say 2500 attack or higher dark monster. So for the most part, you're seeing this in Labrynth, but you know what, there are certain other decks. For example, at least if we sort of kind of rewind back, Spright, especially when Runick Spright first became a thing, with them being able to end on a 3200 Gigantic so easily, Eradicator was also quite popular at that time, even like tier limits with with like, you know, the Griffin and Curious combo, but even let's say something like Branded, actually even now you see some side deck lists playing Eradicator. Vanquish Soul is a new deck, and definitely some are playing Eradicator in that as well. So it's a pretty toxic card. We've definitely seen in one of the Nats streams in the finals, but even before that, this card was definitely something that I really felt should be banned, because it just can be very, very toxic, especially in an environment with Labrynth where they can turbo it out a lot easier than any other deck can. And so now moving on to the final tier, we have Kurikara Div Incarnate, which is sort of like in the likes of Kaiju, but can be worse depending on your deck. Now this card in particular sees more play in Vanquish Soul because of that fire attribute, and you can actually watch my most recent Vanquish Soul top cut deck list analysis. Basically I go through some like the most played hand traps, staples, and engines and tech choices in that list, and I think it will be very helpful in terms of helping you prepare whether you're playing the deck or whether you're going against that deck in, you know, whatever kind of event that you have. But you know what, Kurikara can be very, very strong. It can really catch people off guard, and it's kind of hard to play around it, right? It's essentially like, do you think they have it and you just don't use any of your interruptions, or you just do it and put on better habit, and that's probably the better choice, but definitely can be game ending in a lot of cases. Next we have Lava Golem. It's funny because this card seems to always see a pretty good amount of play on Dueling Book, but in terms of like top cut lists, right now I'm not seeing that much play. I'm seeing Labrynth players actually just go more towards Sphere mode instead, which can get rid of 3 monsters. Obviously they both have like their pros and cons. I mean, this card can also deal burn damage, which is always a nice plus, but you know what, you do have to deal with also a 3000 attack body that hopefully you can take care of. So definitely can go back and forth between those two cards, but also it really depends on your deck, because you know you have to be a deck that can't really rely on a normal summon, because you're going to be able to not normal summon if you use Lava Golem or Sphere mode for that matter. So Kaijus might be a better choice for most decks out there. And then finally, we have D-Barrier, which is kind of funny that it fell down so hard lately. I mean, obviously, this is something that Labrynth will still be able to turbo out, though. And it's certainly still good against Branded. But against something like, you know, Kashtira, it's always been considered eh. And so, I know I can kind of see why it's declining. It's kind of interesting, though, because I at least thought that the match win percentage when this card's used would be higher. Just because even if there's a small number of decks using it, if they do use it, I just assumed it would actually be pretty obliterating. But it was pretty low in terms of win percentage. Again, I did mention those caveats about relying on these Dueling Book win percentages for specific cards. At the same time, I think there is still some kind of message there. And so, you know what? I still think that this card should be banned, though. I think at some point it's always going to come back again and be very like meta staple in most lists. So I think for the better of the game, it should just be gone. But for now, perhaps it's fine. So that was it for the video. Hopefully it was helpful in helping you build your main or side deck as you prepare for your next event. A big thanks for all of you for watching, and a really big thanks to my Patreons and my newest Patreons in Luis Suarez as well as Sunny HF 2020. Really appreciate the support. I'm really surprised that I have any Patreons to begin with, so really means a lot. So anyways, take care guys.